Pluralsight Expert Access. I'm Steve Buchanan, and I'll be your host for this episode. If you're new to this series, this is where we gain access to some of the best minds in tech to hear how tech leaders are solving business challenges and hear their takes on what's new and next. I'm excited to chat with Andrew Shafer today. Andrew Shafer helped create tools and practices that made DevOps a word. Basically, he's a living legend, and I'm super excited to talk with him today and excited to have him on the show and pick his brain around platform engineering and a number of other topics.
Well, thanks for having me. I don't know if I'm a legend in everyone's mind, but certainly privilege and an honor to be here and have this conversation with you.
Awesome. So just jumping right in here. So folks often talk about you founding DevOps. And you typically respond with like DevOps is a pattern of success. I want to take some time and like unpack that. What do you mean exactly by DevOps as a pattern of success?
So that I talk about things that they're like these timeless patterns, right? And if you look at when DevOps was starting to be a conversation, people starting to use that word. I didn't think we needed a new word at the time. I was just applying what I thought were the patterns that seemed to be working. And I was giving talks around what I called agile infrastructure. And it was essentially extending agile practices, specifically continuous integration to infrastructure. And it's interesting to reflect on. In some of this, I filled in more gaps after the fact. But if you go back in time and look at the things that Deming was talking about in the 50s, or the Tavistock Institute's research into socio-technical systems, there's all these principles and practices that just manifest themselves in the new reality, and we want to give them new labels and new words, but it's really timeless practices of aligning incentives and the practices and the tools with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Mm, very, very interesting. So building off you being a founder, and
I
you've
mean, usually
founded.
when people say that, I kind of say that's embarrassing, and then if you tell the whole story, like DevOps wasn't invented; it was emergent practice from the Darwinian pressure to deliver at high velocity, feature velocity, with reliability at scale inside of these big web companies. So that's what I had this privileged access to, right? So if you think about the different things that I got to work on over the last 2 decades, going back to Puppet, it gave me access to these people and these projects inside of these places. And so I was just pattern matching across the industry, what was seeming to work. And that was really what became like this conversation around DevOps. And I think this continued till today, right? If you think about the we'll call it osmosis. Kubernetes represents these patterns that were developed inside of Google, going back to the beginning of Google in some ways, and then you have the Netflix patterns. You have all these kind of common things that emerge, and then it takes time to get to the rest of the industry because they don't have those same pressures to make those practices necessary.
So I want to touch on you like founding companies for a second. So you founded companies in the past, and you founded a new one recently, Ergonautic. And I spent some time checking out the website and what you do, and it looks really interesting. Looks like you do a number of different things, like you offer a number of different services, and it looks like platforms is a part of what you offer. Can you expand a little bit more on like what your company is that you just launched and maybe what it's like to be a founder too?
So I think there's a lot to unpack, but if we go back through the story in parallel to the point I was just making, starting before I worked on Puppet, I worked for a couple venture funded startups as an employee, and came to the conclusion that I could make bad decisions as well as any of these people I was working for that seemed to be getting millions of dollars. And then you go to the kind of emergence of DevOps and Puppet. From there, I was VP of engineering for an OpenStack startup that was sold to EMC. I spent time inside of the pivotal, EMC VMware machine doing Cloud Foundry and Spring stuff, and then the last 3 years before Ergonautic, working on the Red Hat IBM ecosystem. So you have the OpenShift and Ansible and all that kind of fun stuff there. And one of the things that I came to realize in sort of the foundation of the stuff we're trying to do with Ergonautic is at some point there's tool confusion, and you're limited. And going back even before that story started, I got way into the agile community. So I was hanging out with Alistair Coburn and some of those people. Then that really informed what became the DevOps conversation, was my experience with Alistair and some of the agile practices. And so then you get to this point where you're working for a vendor and they're trying to sell a particular vision of what a platform is, and sometimes that's in conflict with what you think someone should do. And so Ergonautic is founded as a pure consultancy where we're agnostic to technology, and we want to start with not what's the tool set you're going to use, but what's the actual mission, what are you trying to accomplish, and then back into the workflows that are going to be optimal for your particular organization.
I love that idea. I've done a lot of ITSM work over the course of my career. I've done a lot of DevOps work, and more recently like cloud native. And usually when projects don't succeed, it's not always because of the technology. It's because no one took the time to step back and kind of look at the process or the mission of like, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are we even doing this? And they jump right into the tools. So
There's a lot of focus on what and how, and not enough why in so many of these
mm,
cases.
yeah, so that sounds like you're hitting a sweet spot in the market where there's been a gap for a long time, and I'm excited to see where you go with this new company. Um, so you've spent a large portion of your career focused on helping people deliver software with better tools, processes, etc. Is platform engineering the final stage?
There's no final boss here, right? And I think this is one of the things that people confused about their DevOps, their Agile, whatever. You're never done, right? The only sustainable advantage you have as an organization is your ability to learn, your ability to change your behaviors with new information. And not only would I say platform engineering is not the final stage, there's literally nothing new in the conversation. If it helps your organization to reframe some of these things in the language and get the budget to go change the thing that you failed at changing when you quote unquote adopted DevOps, then by all means take advantage of that opportunity. But at the same time, going back to the very beginning of my kind of entry into trying to help people with these tools and practices, I noticed that you could give organizations that look very similar the same tools, the same training, and they would get drastically different outcomes. And it was really about their ability to incorporate those practices and those tools and change the way they do things. So many, and I think this is true with the agile transformations, digital transformation, whatever. So many organizations get this checklist of things, and they just change the words and almost no practices. So you had this wave of DevOps adoption where the only thing that really changed was the titles, or maybe putting like this team. You say you have this problem with silos, and what you did was you created a new silo in the middle of your other silos. Didn't change any of your communication patterns. Didn't really change anything except for maybe having Puppet or Chef or whatever in the middle of it. And then now you're going to rub Kubernetes on it, and you still didn't fix the fact that you don't have alignment in your organization about what the work's supposed to look like.
So kind of playing on the platforms are not a new concept, right? They've been around for a while. Um, there was one of your tweets that I found very, very interesting, and there was a line from the tweet, and it said, "Continuous delivery without platform is malpractice." Like that just stuck out to me. Um, can you can you expand on that? Like, is that highlighting that orgs have been doing DevOps without platforms? Like, I feel like there's a story behind that.
So there's kind of two positions I'm going to take, and I was on a debate scholarship in college for a long time, so sometimes I'll argue both sides of things to see the outcome and where it takes the conversation. But there's one part of this where I want to say everyone has a platform, right? Like you have a platform. If you can deploy software at all, you have a platform. You have an inadvertent, like terrible platform that involves emailing this guy or sending a ticket. But if you imagine that there's such a thing as a platform as a service, then there's got to be a platform not as a service, right? And I think if you really want to go through the whole arc of this, you have to give more credit to Heroku than I think people recognize it. Like that was just such
Mm,
a monumental kind of like a milestone in what was available and how people were thinking about some of these problems. So there's that aspect of it, that you have a platform, whatever it is. And then there's all these other buzzwords, right? So there's the microservices buzzword, and then there's the continuous delivery buzzword, and all of those people have for whatever reason compartmentalized those things in some cases into separate things. But for the reality of it, you can't; those are inseparable. DevOps, continuous integration, continuous delivery, microservices, all those things are part of the same elephant that everyone's sort of touching in a different place. So if you think about what it takes
mm,
to do continuous delivery, you've implied that you're going to do some sort of automated deployment. Well, how are you going to do that if it's not a platform? If you're going to have microservices, you're not only so the way I think of this is sort of like the time and space dimensions. If you're doing continuous delivery, you're going to have more deployments in time. Like the frequency of deployment should go up if you're adhering to the principles of continuous delivery. If you're going to do microservices, you're going to have more deployments in space, right? So now you have all these services, and each one of them has
mm,
the ability to be independently deployed. So if you haven't made the investment in something that looks suspiciously like a platform to drive down the fixed cost of deployment for these things that you're going to do more frequently and more of, then you're basically going to be in a world of hurt, and it's going to be a disaster. And people live this. So
you know, it's funny you bring up Heroku, and I agree with you. Like they don't get the credit that they deserve with that platform, right? I mean, it's a
what everyone
really
actually wants is a Heroku. They want their own private Heroku. That's what almost everyone wants.
right. It's funny you bring that up because, and I'm going to go ahead and say this. Hopefully, I'm not going to get in trouble or anything like that. But I work at Microsoft, and I bring up Heroku as examples of like this is what developers want. This is the experience. Like someone should be able to bring their code or their repository to like an AKS and just point it at that and deploy. And there's something called automated deployments in AKS that is kind of there. But yeah, that Heroku experience is amazing, and I agree with you. I think that's where folks are striving to get to, is something like that. So with platform engineering, right? There's a big focus on IDPs, internal developer platforms or internal developer portals, whatever term you want to go with. Are IDPs like at the core of platform engineering, or should folks that are doing platform engineering in their org, should they also focus on all the other technologies that are a part of it as well? Or is it really, should the focus really be around the IDP?
So first, you have to define what IDP means, because depending on whose marking you're reading, that could mean internal developer platform or internal developer portal, both of which are interesting as a way to do it. But it's also kind of like if you went to Egypt and you're like, hey, I'm here to teach you pyramid engineering, it doesn't make sense, right? Heroku's existed for a long time. So when you think about what people are trying to do with their developer portals, I've got line of sight to a lot of organizations who got excited and they installed Backstage, and they thought it was going to fix all these problems. But Backstage, which is an open source project from Spotify that helps you build these developer platform/portals, it's like the fixtures of your sink, right? Your bathroom, which you want nice ones, but like the rest of the plumbing matters too. So if you're going to neglect the rest of that plumbing and have like a really pretty fixture, then you're probably still not going to have the outcome that you were hoping for. You could do better. So you got to be holistic about the way that those underlying things that the platform is giving you access to, the resources. The other thing I think is underappreciated is that platforms imply architectures and the promises that you can keep with those deployments. And you want to be really thoughtful about the promises you want to think through and keep promises about, because the over rotation onto the developer productivity is going to lead to a lot of operational issues in a lot of the projects I've seen people working on. So everyone's excited. They're like developer productivity. They're like, we got to take the cognitive load away from the developers. It's like, well, where do you think the cognitive load's going to go, people? Like it doesn't just go away. It's got to go somewhere. So what's going to happen?
I have to ask this question. We've all seen those ads on Twitter, right? So I'm sure you know the ad I'm gonna ask about, right? It's the ad of like DevOps is dead, like platform engineering is the new thing. Like I just want to get your thoughts on that, like DevOps being dead and platform engineering kind of rising from the ashes.
So if you look at the global DevOps Days community, like DevOps is doing pretty good. And I also think it's funny because at this point, I just celebrate the death of DevOps every year as a holiday. Going back before any of these advertisements, there was always the death of DevOps. But that's a cycle too. With the you can go read articles from 10 years ago about how Agile's dead, and the reality is that buzzwords come, they have a certain momentum, and then people get disillusioned, mostly because they didn't change anything, right? Like the Agile adoption had the same problem where all you did was start having stand-ups and didn't change anything about how you did in any of the other practices, and then you wonder why you don't have good software. So I think this is a similar thing. So there's certainly a group who didn't make the leap, right? Like they didn't really change their behaviors. They got the words, and then they changed them to SRE or what have you. Didn't change anything except for rename the sysadmins to DevOps and SRE. And then they're like, oh, this isn't working. It's like, yeah, you didn't do anything different, so it's not going to work. And then rubbing like some new product on it isn't going to fix it either. But by all means, get your budgets and your org chart set up and go make a new silo. Like, okay, it's gonna work this time.
It's funny. I have seen the same kind of behavior around another technology, PHP. Like every year there's like it seems like there's an uproar and folks are like PHP is dead, and it's been dying for years, right? I'm still waiting on it to actually die, but people have thriving careers around it. So I don't think it's ever going
I
to die.
mean,
So
I would
I think
argue
it's the same
PHP is
thing
the
with
original
DevOps.
microservice framework.
Yeah.
What's easier than just like putting something in a folder to do the deployment? Like, it's fantastic.
Yeah. So generative AI, platform engineering, Kubernetes, GitOps, like tons of buzzwords, right? All these different terms, and like in your opinion, like where are we all headed, and like what's the next evolution of tech, right? So platform engineering is really hot right now, but just kind of
I
where do
mean,
you think what do you think is next?
so the generative AI, let's start there because I'm personally excited about the generative AI stuff and watching other people. So I'm going to quote John Willis, which if you're following like the DevOps conversation, you probably heard of John Willis, and John Willis is like super excited about generative AI and Chat GPT in particular, and I think this frames some of this in a clear way. So he's older than me, and I'm getting pretty old, and he's just like super enthusiastic about it, and said he wrote more code in the last 6 months than he did in the last 10 years, and that's because what some of the so like there's all the generative AI like marketing and being able to do things like write papers and marketing stuff. But for coding, for tools for coding, it's amazing to be able to have this. It's basically like a pair programmer on steroids that will already know a bunch of things. And it doesn't mean that it will write all the code for you, but it means that you're starting at a point where most of the stuff, and I'll quote John here, he's like, everything that I didn't like about coding goes away, and everything I love about coding happens 10 times faster. Right. So I think from a perspective of being able to generate code, these tools are amazing. Right. And then you have Copilot, you have a bunch of these other things emerging. They're super interesting in that regard. But if you think about this platform story, the DevOps story, the SRE, another thing I think is worth shouting out. If you actually read the SRE book, there's very explicit platform language in the SRE book. So for all the people that somehow adopted SRE without having a platform, like good luck with that. My favorite is when they adopt SRE and don't have SLOs. Like, what did you do at all, like to make SRE happen? So there's that. So in some ways, like the future just looks like the past. It's just with generative AI, we're going to do more of it faster. So now that you have the ability to make code faster, that barrier, that kind of friction point in the process is going to go down. So you're going to have all this code, but now the problem of taking some code that mostly works and putting it in production and keeping it running is going to get that much harder, because now you have 10 times more code coming into those pipelines than you did before, or whatever the multiple is, right? So there's some big multiplier on the dev side of it, but I just don't see that happening as fast on the ops side. So I think it will actually elevate the necessity for the operational excellence that you would hope you'd already been investing in with your DevOps and SRE investments. Another thing I think is interesting when you talk about DevOps is dead, or the like future of this evolving. This is something I think people didn't really realize when you talk about any of these like infrastructure as code, platform projects. That is software that needs to be operated as well. The platform itself is a service that needs to be operated. So at the very least, there needs to be this like ops component that's focused on the platform. And furthermore, no platform right now will keep 100% of the promises for operating the software that runs on it. So the idea that your platform, if you believe that your platform is going to take all of the ops away from any of your kind of workflows, then you're in for some very fun outages in your future.
Well, thank you for all of that. That was super insightful. And so that this brings us to the towards the end of our time together. You're a legend. You're pretty humble. I think you're a legend. For those out there that are watching this, that are coming into tech, maybe they're new, maybe they've just started, you've been around for a while. What, like, one piece of advice could you give those folks for their career in tech?
So I'm going to kind of divide it into organizational advice and then individual advice. So it's interesting when you say coming into tech, that there's still to this day organizations that will have a conversation internally where they say we're not a tech company. And I think more and more that's hard for them to say and get away with. So there's huge opportunities in a lot of traditional organizations to modernize the capabilities. And what I would say to those organizations is get involved with the communities. And there, like I put a lot of nonsense on Twitter, but one of the things that I got people lathered up about is I said you'll get more out of trying to contribute to an open source project for a month than you will from an infinite amount of agile coaching. And just like seeing how code gets deployed, how code gets created in an open source project, really eye opening for organizations that are coming into quote unquote tech. And then I would make similar advice to an individual, which is we live in this amazing time where we can communicate with people around the world, around the clock. And those communities of practice that emerge around these different open source projects are a fantastic resource for you to participate in and learn from because they're solving their real problems, ostensibly their real problems, not always, but usually they're close to their problems, and being part of those communities like changed the trajectory of my career. Like you wouldn't have DevOps without open source. You wouldn't have cloud computing without open source communities. Period. Full stop. And that's like a totally different conversation. And then to frame that, and this is reinforced in almost every talk I've given for the last 10 years, that the only real sustainable advantage is learning, and learning is changing behaviors, right? So when you think about what it takes to get skills in a sport or in music or in anything, when you can do it better, then you do it better, right? And that's learning. That's the new behavior, the manifestation of the new behavior. So don't get on the buzzword treadmill and like get new vocabulary. Really get to the core of what is a behavior that you can change. Like what if I believe this is true, whatever it is, platform engineering is true. What's the like? Don't worry about the novelty, like the buzzword. Who cares? Does it make me better, right? And this is something that I would encourage anyone to think about. Is like, what can I do different today that I couldn't do tomorrow? And what am I investing in myself so I can have a new behavior the next day and the next day and the next day? And that's the continuous improvement that I think is at the core of really going back to Deming, lean. Like that's this timeless pattern, is that continuous improvement of yourself and your organization.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you, Andrew, for coming on the show today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and dropping those gems. I got a lot out of this conversation and enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure the viewers will as well. So thank you. Anything else you want to say before we kind of wrap up here?
Just thanks for having me. And I feel like sometimes uh, we kind of keep having the same conversation over and over for 10 years, but then at some point, so people ask me like, don't you get bored of talking about this DevOps stuff? And on some level, it's not the novelty, right? It doesn't matter how many times you said it; it matters how many people still need to hear it. And
Mm.
it's such a privilege and an honor to have this career and be able to work in tech. And I really hope that people pick up the torch, and I don't consider myself a legend. And in fact, I feel like I still have a lot more things to accomplish. And hopefully there's other people that will hear this and they'll do better. Like whatever it is, don't worry about the buzzwords. Like, can you do better than you did before? That's what matters.
Check out the show notes to see the resources mentioned today. We hope you'll follow, subscribe, or review this series and send us any feedback you have on how we can improve the format and future episodes. Thank you.